Welcome to the Movement Prescription Podcast. I'm Callum Lees, and I'm delighted to have Robert Jamison on today's episode. Robert Jamison is a pioneering architect with a Netflix show called Your Home Made Perfect. We recently met at a wedding, and I asked him at the time if he had an unlimited budget, how he would design healthcare settings for movement. His answer was great, and so I decided I wanted to ask him it again on the podcast. Robert and I process the world quite differently, not least spatially, which is one of the reasons I find a conversation so stimulating. I don't agree with him on everything, but his take on things often made me view things differently and offered a fresh perspective. I really hope you find this conversation enjoyable, stimulating, and enlightening. And if there's two things you take away, hopefully, one is how we can design buildings differently, particularly to increase movement, and the second, to avoid me at weddings. Hope you enjoy. Hi, Robert. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
No worries. It's an exciting conversation to have. So I wanted to start, and I think, often it's a kind of a helpful place to start is just knowing where people have come from and what their background is, and particularly on a podcast about physical activity. I kind of wanted to start by asking you a bit about your background and your upbringing, and wondering kind of what that was like regarding physical activity and health in general.
Well, it's a very interesting question, and it's one that I've reflected on much, over the past years, just in terms of where I am at now in my career. In fact, last week I just turned 50. So it's a kind of that first half century, it actually started, I grew up with a family of 9. I have 6 siblings, and we lived in rented accommodation, social housing, if you like. It was rented accommodation. It was actually an experimental post-war housing development. Concrete floors, concrete walls, single glazed windows, no central heating. I still think the floors were asbestos, but it was a very kind of I would say it was a hard enough environment to live in, particularly without kind of central heating. And even to this day, I still brush my teeth with warm water because often that was the only heat, apart from the clothes you wore, that would provide that comfort. But anyway, it was a wonderful kind of upbringing, with within a big family. But it's that kind of setting that really I feel established my passion for architecture and to understand how people live. And of course, architecture is such a broad subject that kind of encompasses all subjects, I would argue. Philosophy, psychology, the sciences, and of course, even the idea of physical activity is really interesting because in my most recent teaching in masters, a number of years ago, I had a masters unit in Queen's Queen's University in Belfast, and I'm really interested in what's called the apparatus of living and how our homes actually are quite unhealthy spaces to live in. They make us sedentary. Chairs, like this sit is an interrupted squat, for example. I feel as a phrase that I use often is life happens on the floor, and but to get back to my upbringing, it was in this kind of like social housing. It was an interesting kind of journey, and then actually at the age of 11, I met a good friend whose father was an architect, and that also kind of really inspired my journey. But physical activity back then, it was like we were walking to school. School. I mean, today kids are kind of lifted and laid, and back then, we would march to school every day. And even like going back other generations, my father, he's 90 this year, and he talks about, his walk to school, which was, at a young age on his own, 1940s, late 30s, early 40s, and he would he'd be walking his 3 miles to school and back every day. I mean, I was walking maybe a mile when I was maybe that age, but at the end, as you kind of grow and time goes on and technology changes and cars become more widespread, and people have a totally different way of engaging with their physical realm.
Now, what's interesting about that, and I think my next question was going to be, did you play sport as a kid? But actually, I think before that, it's really important to recognize what you said about walking. That your commute to school was a walk. It wasn't something that you necessarily labeled as exercise or physical activity. It was just part of the day to day, which is something we've lost in the 21st century.
Yes, I mean, because back then, not everyone had a vehicle, or and particularly when there's 9 of us, I mean, there's seatbelts weren't a thing back then, and there'd be 3 in the passenger seat, and five in the back, so it was kind of it was a different way of traveling and journeying and living, um, in terms of your comment there, sport happened in school. School was focused on sport, less so, I would argue, today. In fact, I've got a young family, and it's disappointing whenever they can't play in the grass, or when in the winter when the snow falls, they have to stay out of the snow, and it's almost like these restrictions because of risk. We become so risk averse, and it impacts on the health and well-being of our children. But yes, sport. Yes, it was through school. It was there was opportunities for to engage in team sports. But I guess as well as that, back then my health wasn't great. I suffered asthma as a younger child, so that kind of impacted on my ability to kind of play sport. Which was, I mean, it was what it was, but I put that down to environment and things like that, But maybe today there's more opportunity for sport as well for kids, and certainly our young family, they play sport every with school and weekends, and we kind of encourage them in the team sports. It's very important, very healthy for them. So I guess it depends on the setting and the family and conditions. And
I know now, last time we talked, you kind of really interested in health or well-being, and you've done a lot of yoga. You've taken time out and traveled around India. How did that come about, and how does you looking after your own well-being integrate into your day-to-day now as a celebrity architect?
Celebrity is interesting when you say that. I mean, only because of that work, which became kind of very well received from Netflix. But it was such a small body of my work from my decades of practice, so it's really interesting and very kind of you to kind of appreciate my work. But so I think that whenever I had my own practice, so I was kind of I always had ideas and ambition, because again, going back to my upbringing and certainly the way I kind of grew up, and and I was interested in how other people lived, and that kind of passion, to study architecture became a real kind of passion to understand the world we live in, but understand also health and well-being, because I mean, I abused my body, in those younger years. I smoked. I kind of, I was kind of, it was just an opportunity to kind of escape from the day-to-day normality, which I would feel isn't kind of, society isn't set up to kind of support kids as they grow, and that's why they turn to kind of other means to kind of create their own reality. So I abuse my body, but then you realize that health is very important, and it's wonderful to be healthy, and there's and I spent, whenever I established my own practice in 2005, I was running 10Ks every other day. I was I half marathons, and so I was very active because of that supported my need to actually be able to think and practice and work and free myself from essentially allow me to focus. I mean, that as a anyone who understands fitness understands what that does to the mind.
It's almost a coping mechanism, isn't it? It's a form of processing.
It's a form of processing, but if you can balance the energy of the body, the mind will follow. That's the kind of and that's why, in fact, I ran my last 10K on the 15th of September 2009 because the next day I got a one-way ticket to India, and I traveled as a nomad for the following 5-6 years. And when you're traveling, in rural locations in India and Asia, there isn't an opportunity for a 10K run. And I explored then other kind of forms of physical activity or practice. I'd already engaged in yoga before that, when I lived in Dublin many years before that. Excuse me, and late 90s, and it just became part of my day-to-day practice. And I started with Ashtanga yoga, and I was practicing Ashtanga for 10 years, and that was kind of like pretty hardcore. It is a difficult practice. It was created for for the release of built up energy, in young men, and it can lead to all sorts of problems in joints. And in fact, I had reconstructive surgery of my right knee, because I was just kind of focused on these kind of practices within the primary series and secondary series of Ashtanga yoga. I then kind of evolved and developed that, and then more vinyasa, and now I practice Kundalini, which is again about the movement of energy, but that just supports my day-to-day living practice. And saying that as well, it's not just physical. It's once you understand or grow to understand the world you live in, you really and start to see how the impact of our culture on the health of our species. Then you really kind of, and this is when you start to uncover, what's good for you and what's not, and what you should be eating and what you should, and how the body operates and functions and what supports the body. And then again, it's only through education and learning, but self-education, because you need to be proactive in educating yourself if you want to grow old and be healthy. And I want to grow old. I want to, be aware of my last breath and be healthy.
I think it's a really interesting point you make. You almost alluded to kind of yoga and maybe physical activity more generally almost being a gateway into a holistic lifestyle, whereby when you become more in tune with your body, you want the other elements in place, whether that's sleep or diet. And I suppose a lot of that comes through kind of self-directed learning, isn't it? But also trial and error.
Yeah, all of it, but certainly self-directed learning and being kind of open to reading the body and reading self and, understanding self. And that old cliche, we know everything, all the answers are within, and I, even in my practice, in my working practice, you feel your way through life. I feel my work, and, those decisions you make intuitively, when I'm designing a building, and designing space, it's intuitive, it's understood through the body before it's through the mind, and I think that's really interesting. But these only kind of, as I say, now that I've reached, I'm now 50 years old, and I think about, first of all, I've never been as healthy in my life as I am today, and that's because of my diet, that's because of my lifestyle, that's because of my choices, and the importance of understanding, well, I guess through the desire to self-educate and learn and understand what is good for me and what's not, and good for our species and what's not, and it's controversial as well, the things that, my kind of position on certain kind of, attitudes in our cultural context, but it's, for me, there's certain practices that I have and that I, need to support me. And as I say, I've never been healthier. And that's just not physical. That's also kind of other ways of kind of understanding the world we live in. And, it's not just this physical realm. And I've been working with plant medicine for a long time. And, so it's our culture that kind of pushes against, or things that, when you realize that are necessary for us, and offers us kind of these aspects of living that are actually unhealthy for us, in fact, the entire, or I would argue, even most of our social kind of structure is either weaponized, controlled, or contrived for the means of purpose for another rather than self. If that makes sense.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was about particularly our environment, not being designed for health and well being. There's one question I wanted to ask just before we launch into that, which was, you mentioned that you want to live longer, to live healthier, and I'm just intrigued. Earlier in the conversation, you talked about abusing your body, and I'm just intrigued as to what your motivations are now to want to live a long and healthy life. What are the kind of things that keep you on track, or is it such that it's so embedded in your routine now that actually it's just part and parcel with who you are?
I've got a lot I want to do. I mean, I've a young family,
Yeah.
well, and I've a lot that I want to do, and it's only through kind of understanding. It's a self-directed understanding and realization of maybe mistakes that have been made, but um, not kind of necessarily through my own choice, but through kind of, as I say, what's presented to us in our kind of culture as being necessary ways of living or being. Even the idea of I mean, I've recently have kind of arrived at a stage where the whole way we live, it feels so unnatural to me, right? That I am now kind of, in a place where I want to rethink and reimagine it all. And I have spent the past years doing that. And I want to kind of start to evolve these projects that can start to reveal ways in which we should should be living for health and well-being, and even in terms of architecture, which is my passion, even how we live in these homes and that kind of these orthogonal spaces, I feel that fundamentally is not how we should be living in, rooms that are 90 degrees. And it's really interesting that there was a podcast recently on Joe Rogan with a guy, Howard, what was his name? I forgot. Thomas Howard.
We can find
I need
out.
to
I can
find
stick it in
that.
the show notes afterwards, Robert. And yeah.
I find out it was a very striking kind of conversation about the how our whole physical environment that is presented in science, for example, is all incorrect, and how a line doesn't exist and everything has an orthogonal form. And essentially that's what I've been kind of um, kind of exploring in my practice for 2 decades. And I can recall, like the first sculpture I made for an exhibition, which was exploring this idea of order and chaos and the line and the non-orthogonal, and we are non-orthogonal beings. There's no lines in nature, and we should be living in environments that support our need. And the energy of the body, is impacted by the energy of the space that we occupy. And if we are in boxes, then that just impacts our health and well-being. And it's interesting because I grew up in Belfast in the 1980s and 90s, went to school, and there was a time whenever there was a lot of conflict, and daily you were when I look back on it, it was a really strange time. Then when you were going through it, it was just normal. But I think that's what also gave me an awareness of space and environment, because you had to be aware of where you were and the energies within the room or in the street, and I think that's, that kind of really important to understand the energetic universe that we live in. And again, in my work, understanding that, you understand kind of the disharmony that exists within our built environment, and Yeah, I mean, I could talk about why that is, or why that's being perpetrated or pushed, or but I also am interested in what we can do to kind of solve those problems that can just help to heal us. Because my architecture or my practice is about creating spaces that can heal. There's a reason why we enjoy being in the forest or swimming in the ocean. To be totally connected to nature, to be totally connected to that energy that supports us, that nourishes us, that has a relationship with us. Once we're in the built environment within these rooms, they are open prisons, I would argue. And, you can see even what's happening now in that NOTE project in Saudi Arabia. And, it's a city that's going to house 10 million people. I mean, that
Is that the
there is
line?
a
The line it's called, Robert. Is
line.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you just have to kind of think about that and ignore just to think about it, just meditate on what that building would be like, and really it's not what you would imagine, and even the idea of the 15-minute city is just a way of corralling kind of people, getting them all, into these kind of habitats which are, forced and unnatural. And there's there are those people who think, well, these 15-minute cities are to get people out exercising on their bikes, but that's just one side of a story. And in my opinion, that is the propaganda that is kind of like forced upon us.
Interesting. I'm not totally against the 50-minute city concept, but parking that, I'd love to know what your how you would envisage, how would you envisage a built environment or a town or a city that was good for well-being? And I think you alluded to that somewhat. It's kind of slightly less organized and lots of green space, but yeah, what would it look like?
I mean, less so. I mean, I think about the hill, the village kind of concept, and the idea of community. Well, first of all, I mean, it's a whole shift in societal thinking. It's a whole shift in social structure. It's getting back to extended families or certainly small communities. That can help and support one another. So it's environments. It's the village type environment. And these pockets of villages could exist. And have the right amenities to support them. The school. Once you start to kind of, I mean, certainly, there's a place for a city that you can, it could be a working environment or a social environment, but home is a different place. It's home is where we spend most of our lives. It's where we need it to be a healing space. It's really interesting whenever, I have a book on the architecture of the animal kingdom, it talks about like bird, the structures that kind of bird build or, nests or, whatever these might be in the animal kingdom and how they're built but yet these kind of animals kind of explore their terrain for their purposes. So it's a bigger kind of, if you want to take it to that extreme of kind of idea and I'm thinking, it becomes community focused organization of people, who are living on the earth. They're actually touching the earth. They aren't, you know, uh, yeah, I mean, it's, they are living in high rise. They aren't kind of, living in ghettos, which is kind of just what streets can become, and, but they're living in these environments that are holistic, that are supportive, and even just in the home, for example, is living in natural environments. Like when I look back to projects or people who come to me and and what advice on their plans say, and that's why I've set up this masterclass, which starts very soon, and that's really to explore how people or problems that people are having with their living environments, right? And existing buildings, the existing building stock is what we have to live in, and we have a shortage of housing, right? So it's a conversation that ideally must be had with people who are in a position to start creating these new solutions of ways of living, and it's not developers, and it's not government officials, and it's not it's none of that, because they have no interest in doing that, and they have other kind of ideas and needs. But I think as a people, for example, when we start to live in environments that are that sit outside the conditioned self, right? So we are conditioned to think that we need to have, a 3 bedroom house with 2 en suites and, a front door to the street. And it's important how the building looks from the street and all these ideas. And these ideas are just kind of adopted, um, kind of, unaccepted norms or conditions, right, that we accept at birth because they're part of our culture. But it's only when you start to kind of critique all of that and think about it, then you think, oh, what do we really need? Ideally, and I speak to people, maybe there's a couple who want to have a 3 bedroom house. And my question is, well, why do you want to have a 3 bedroom house? And there's only two of you, but what do you really need? And what they only need is one volume. So maximize, for example, if they're building a house, maximize the volume. And then over time, you start to live in it and grow within this larger volume that you can then start to subdivide, and, internally.
Can I ask what you mean by one volume, Robert? Is it kind of like a vaulted space?
Yeah, your vaulted space, a large room, right? Just a volume. But what I'm also interested in, and in my work, is getting rid of those labels, right? That we have bedroom, bathroom, living room, bedroom. They're all rooms for certain functions. Living room, I mean, we live in an entire house. If we're in the bed, we're still living, but we're actually, asleep. So start thinking about, how, a space to sleep or a space to eat. And then you start to think, well, we don't need, a couple of thousand, square foot. Or even, do you need, well, what do you actually need and what's important? And are you just kind of wanting to go on the property ladder because that's a cultural kind of, push or a cultural norm, But ways of living, in the simplest terms, is about kind of breaking the orthogonal for me, right? And not just, you see it, in my work in Netflix, Your Home Made Perfect. In those projects, it was kind of creating new ways of living, so it was breaking the volume, to create another geometry to kind of, to allow the energy to flow through the house, or indeed creating simply, adding a second staircase can create an energetic flow through a building that is different than one route that takes you upstairs, for example, to bedroom and back down again, the same route. You create a second, a second staircase, and you transform how the occupants kind of live in that home, So, I mean, it's just.
I was going to ask in terms of kind of movement in the space, particularly, as someone who's passionate about getting people moving more, is it the energy design itself which inspires movement, or are there things in those spaces that themselves can create people to move more?
Well, I think, okay, so again, as I mentioned there earlier, the sit is an interrupted squat, right? And I think that, the three-piece sofa is the travesty of our current kind of, way of living, right? And, it just, the idea that it's placed in front of the TV. And often, a client would say, well, where's the TV going to be placed, And it's, anyway, but the sofa is for, I mean, a three-piece suite, the three-seater is comfortable for one and maybe two. The two-seater is comfortable for one, and the one-seater isn't comfortable at all. And then it gives you this upright position where your feet are on the floor. And really, our bodies do not want to be doing that. They want to be kind of moving and resting and reclining, or like just comfortable in a way that feels comfortable. And that's why in my work, I talk about the day bed. And it's got a depth to it. It's about 1.2 meters deep. It's a surface, these surfaces, and I call them, kind of, surfaces for occupation, right? And what that means is you're kind of changing floor level. So it allows you to kind of move and be on the floor or an elevated floor, which is kind of a deep sofa or a day bed. You can sleep on it. But this here starts to get you mobile, right? Because mobility is so important. And all we need to do is look to the east and look at how mobile the eastern populations are, and that's because they are mobile. They are moving. I mean, the classic or the most important or the most ignored or overlooked is the toilet, right? The toilet is so unhealthy. The throne toilet is an invention that comes down from the monarchies, from those kind of oppressors, right? That we've accepted as this is how we use the toilet, and it even has infected now the actual eastern kind of, locations and places, So I remember I was in Singapore when I was traveling, and there was an expo I was an architect from Expo, right? I was like, I was all products. I was like, and I made a beeline to the toilet section because I was expecting to see all these squat toilets, and and it was Western toilets, and there was one squat toilet. But the toilet, right, the Western toilet, it's known to kind of, it's bad for our biomechanics. It can create IBS. It can create cancer, and it's known to kind of, it's so unsupportive. It leads to all sorts of issues in the bowels. Whereas the squat toilet, there's a reason why we squat, and even the squat. In fact, my boys, I get them to squat often barefoot on the grass, and we're on the grass because it's healing. Being barefoot on the grass is healing, but being able to squat is such an important, kind of activity, and like most people can't squat. I mean, like actually sit comfortably on their feet, so they're sitting on their, and I think this is really important. And that's why I've been exploring this idea of the east-west hybrid toilet, which is kind of, it understands, the Western kind of body and how it's been conditioned to kind of sit on a seat, but it then lowers that and lifts the heel, because if you lift your heel, it's easier to squat down. It's that kind of, it's the calf that hasn't got that length. So if you can address that, then you can kind of create a squatting position which is better for the bowels. It allows you to kind of, defecate, and
Yeah, it's really interesting.
and it's
Yeah.
the cleanest way to actually go to the toilet. You don't need to touch anything. You don't need to sit in anything. And it's good for you internally. And for me, that mobility is so important. And then once you start to realize that, and it's really kind of you start to understand things that are also more important, flexibility, mobility, and the joy of being flexible, the joy of running up a staircase, and a lot of people can't do that, who you are. There's at my age, or the older you get, less people are able to kind of are as active as they used to be, because of, and I'd say that it can be transformed through just these moments in the home. Also another thing is people say, I would like to retrofit, or I would like to kind of, future proof my home. And so I'd like to have a bedroom downstairs. And so I might use a staircase. And I'm like, you want to use a staircase, continue to use a staircase. If what's that expression? Um, if you don't use it, you lose it, kind of thing. So if you want to stay downstairs, you're going to be downstairs. If you want, like, go walking. In fact, I was on a flight there last week, and I was beside a guy who was 87 or whatever, very fit. And I asked him, saying he looked very fit, he was trim, and we're chatting away. He was in Belfast, he was traveling on to London, and he grew up in Belfast for a few years, and then he lived across the world, but he's Californian, and he walks every day. He says 15,000 steps a day, and he's active. It's so important. These things are so important, And if you realize that, when you see people of the older generation who are fit and healthy, and you ask them, about their health and well-being, they will talk about walking, they will talk about the need for movement, all of that.
And it's these people, and I think my grandmother was the same. She lived to her mid-90s, and she wouldn't do traditional. She wouldn't go for a run. She never ran in her life, but she walked everywhere. She had a traditional toilet, but but she did. I say traditional, like a throne toilet, but yeah. Look, I think it's so interesting. You talk a lot of the movements you talked about, like the squat, the step up, or effectively that's a lunge. There's a few foundational movements we do day to day or we need to do: squatting, lunge, the push, the pull. I'm trying to think of any others, but yeah, maybe the lift as well. But there's kind of 5 foundational movements, and if we can build them into our day to day routine just by the stuff we have to do, then we'll have a big impact.
That's really interesting, kind of just saying that. And it makes me think about, how do you build these movements into the architecture of the space, right? However, we have building control of our buildings, right? Which impacts on our opportunity to actually live in spaces that are more dynamic, or, offer more opportunities. So, for example, handrails are necessary. Yeah, and there's even, I've met clients or whatever who are like, so there's a step down from the garden or to the garden, maybe 500 mil, and they're like, handrail there. I'm like, yes, building control will require a handrail of 600 mil, but kids will not want to have a handrail. Your kids, becomes a playground. The home becomes a playground for kids. And I think that's really important. In my work, there's always that change in level. I think it's very important to have a change in level, steps up, steps down. You can see it, in my work. There's a project. It was in Stirling. I think it was series 2, episode 1, maybe, or series 1, episode 1, Stirling in Scotland, and it had this here kind of circular route, but these steps, and I was able to kind of, I was able to, it was accepted by building control because it was an alternative route that there could be a larger step and 2 smaller steps. Except, you need to see it. But again, the night after the filming of the reveal of that project, I got a video call from the client who was absolutely delighted and sent a video of the kids just running round and round and up these steps. And it was such a small space, but it became a playground. And playgrounds don't, it doesn't need to stop at kids. If you have a high level and you can lie on it, as an adult, and you're mobile and fit, you'll lie on it. You will, and it gives you opportunity as well when you're older. And if you have a young family or grandkids, you can play with them. We're all kids. We just get experience.
No, and I know you'll have had a lot more interaction with building control than I ever will, and I'm sure they have a role. But I love that concept of having different size steps, because I think, Joe, if you've got smaller ones, they basically work muscles in different ways or in different capacities. So yeah, it's another really interesting kind of concept in design. A couple more things just before we finish, Robert, I wanted to ask was, a lot of the listeners to the podcast are health professionals in some capacity. And I remember at the wedding when we met, my question to you, which is why I wanted to get you on, was, if we were to redesign health spaces, GP practices in particular, that's my interest, what would they look like? And you give a really fascinating answer, which involved the Eden Project. But such was the answer. I wanted to re-ask that question and see if you've got the same answer or a different one.
It's just the aspiration, as an architect, and you often think, what is that project, or how should we be living on the land, and it's not even just, GP practice in hospitals. And hospitals are not very inviting places, they're, and they're what they are, but they're usually big, deep plans, and it's fluorescent lighting, and, because of cost, right?
And functionality as well, I suppose, to some extent, but
yeah. But you still have functionality, and I get natural lighting, but cost, to get natural lighting is a cost. The cheapest building you can build is a cube, and then, once you start to add surface area to elevation, it becomes, more expensive, But anyway, so hospitals are depressing places, and I often think about hospitals, but I also think about, even school buildings or homes. What can the home be? What can a school be? What can a hospital be? What can a GP practice be? And a GP practice and a school could be the same thing. So I often think about, what is that? Because I'm interested in the model building, or that unit building, right, that could be repeated. And we talked about the Eden Project, because the Eden Project allows you to have shelter from the elements and touch the ground and be within a natural environment. And we love being in natural environments, right? So it's about that, and that's why we kind of holiday in warm climates where we can be outside and be connected to the environment. We can't be connected more to the environment than when we're swimming in the ocean, But anyway, so I think that, the idea, and I mentioned this I remember when I was on Twitter, and, that account since closed, but I this idea, I pinned this idea about, the holy grail of architecture is having a transparent, insulated net, if you like, or foil that you can drape over any structure, so it gives you shelter within a natural environment. You then, but of course, to actually make that a reality, you're talking about a geodesic structure that becomes, the Eden Project. And I say that because I have this idea as well, but building the idea of a school or a building or a community hall, for a group of people that is essentially, if you imagine Kew Gardens, the glass house in Kew Gardens, so it's that at a scale that gets the light in. It's got a filigree structure. It's transparent. It's got a natural, environment within. So you're within the garden. You're within the garden, and you can sit comfortably. You can converse comfortably, and you understand. And of course, well, the idea is, well, this costs money, but you get it right once, and you don't have to kind of, it can become a model. It can become something like a vehicle. It can be production line technology where you kind of can reduce the cost of the building of this idea because it's a model building, and just kind of, replicate that same model, because all you're doing is creating a garden enclosure. Now, of course, you'll say, well, actually, there's a need for administration spaces, a need for, spaces off that. So then put those to the edge. So, it's almost then, think about a Gothic cathedral that gets all this wonderful light coming in and has these chapels along the edge. So they become the spaces that are, are the treatment rooms, or the classrooms of a larger. So you can take this idea, and the idea as a concept, if you look at the monastic setting or the monastery as a model kind of building typology, where you have a large collection space and smaller rooms for retreat or for sleeping or cells for, prayer, whatever it might be, or for working, cells for working, or a dais, or whatever those words you might want to use, without putting prescriptive names to the rooms. You can then start to think about what architecture can be, and it can be totally undefined. And that's what I enjoy, that's where I like to get to in my work, where you're not defining the spaces, but you're actually creating the environment. And as a species, we know naturally how to occupy it, right? Because if it's in us, it's innate. We migrate towards the light. So if you have this kind of miniature Kew Gardens glass house environment, maybe, it could be maybe 10, 12 meters tall, it could be 10 meters wide, it's transparent, it's glazed, there's mature landscaping, and it's a wonderful space to be in. You would want to be in that space in the light. Then when the light fades and you want to retreat, or, you retreat to smaller, more enclosed, more protected, cocoon-like spaces, and that, but we do that naturally. But that same idea, that concept of that environment, it could be a home, where a collection space, or you retreat to your bedroom. It could be a school, assembly space, or retreat to smaller classrooms. It could be a home for elderly living, where there's a meeting space in the central Kew Gardens, and then you retreat into these side annexes, which is a sleeping environment. It could be a GP practice, where the meeting space, or, is this central space, and the GP, and the practice, rooms are around the side. So it's just that idea, and it gets me back to, to this notion of, the buildings of architects of the animal kingdom. It's like, how should we be living as a species? And that's what I'm really interested in.
Yeah, I think that's really lovely, and the kind of the imagery is powerful, and I think the other thing that's really powerful is it's such a dramatic reconsideration of the spaces that we work in and what they look like. And actually, you've given one example, but I'm sure listeners might have many others, and if you do, please write in or comment on the podcast. We'd love to hear what some of those other ideas are. Well, look, Robert, that's been it's been really amazing, and loved having you on, and definitely there's been some really amazing kind of thoughts you've shared, and you've definitely made me think a bit differently. So yeah, I really value your time. Yeah, I know you're busy, so thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Colin, for the invitation, and it's wonderful to have a chat and meet again, and I really appreciate your time as well.
Oh, cheers, thank you. You can probably tell from previous episodes, I'm passionate about how we can adapt our built environment, and I found Robert really forced me to look at house and environment design from a totally different angle. Our discussion around toilets, and particularly the squat toilet, was really challenging. Although I can't find any evidence linking the use of thrown toilets to cancer, there's growing evidence to support squat toilets to ensure complete evacuation of the bowels and the prevention of hemorrhoids. Advocating for healthier houses and environments, often at the detriment of convenience, is always going to lead to some difficult and hard conversations. But I believe these conversations are worth having, and we must start having. We briefly discussed the 5 foundational movements, and on reflection, I'll probably add a 6th, the twist. I know there's much debate around this, and I'd love to hear from you if you disagree. Offline, Robert and I discussed designing a house to incorporate all the foundational movements. So watch this space. And if you've made any changes to your home environment to facilitate movement, I'd love to hear from you. With home and work environments often merging, small steps like investing in a standing desk can have a big impact on sedentary behaviour. And if you want to save some money, you can do what Susie does and just use an ironing board and a load of old textbooks. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode and that it's reframed the way you think. And if you have enjoyed it, please share it with someone else.